Hello, and welcome to part 2 of our webinar series on the Vertex-Threat-Intel Power-Up. In part 1, we introduced the Power-Up, and specifically the Power-Up workflow, a custom UI element that allows me as an analyst to work more closely with the data and analytical workflows that are most closely tied to my tasking. And specifically in part 1, we talked about how we can use the workflow to work with threat groups and malware families. So for example, I can leverage the workflow to select and view a particular threat cluster. I can look at things like the alternate names that this threat group may be known by in public reporting. I can look at things like the tools and techniques that the group has been seen to use in practice, the type of targeting that the group carries out, and any associated public reporting that may reference this threat in their activity. For part 2 of our webinar, we want to talk to you about how you can leverage the workflow to record activity related to threats and their ongoing operations. Now picture this example. Management has come to you and asked for a roll-up of the types of threat activity that your organization has seen over the past 6 months. Or maybe you're a security company and part of your reporting to your customers is to provide an annual roll-up of your view of the threat landscape. Now, these types of reports can be very time-consuming to prepare because you have to go and pull that data together, review the data, and then obviously publish your findings. But by recording key information about threat activity in Synapse, that data is stored in a structured manner where you can then query that information and get these answers much more quickly. So within Synapse and within the threat intel workflow, there are 4 types of activity that we can record: alerts, attacks, compromises, and campaigns. And those kind of go in order from smallest and most acute to broadest. Alerts in particular, we typically would be ingesting from a SIM or another type of sensor on your network. So we won't touch on these during that webinar. We won't touch on those during this webinar. So I want to start with attacks. And if you tuned into part 1 of our webinar, we used a phishing email as an example of a type of attack that we might want to record. So we took the phishing message itself, the actual RFC 822 file, and the extracted header information, which we parsed out with the Synapse file parser, and recorded information about this phishing attack. We used the time that the phishing message was sent as the date of the attack. So we have the date and time here. Provided a basic description. This was an attack that was targeted at the Latvian parliament based on the receiving email address. And we were able to record information such as the techniques that were used, phishing, the use of a link in that spear phishing message, the industry that was targeted, in this case, national level government, the specific organization, the Latvian parliament, and related reporting. And it turned out that this particular phish was also described in a blog post from CertUA. So we're able to record this kind of higher level operational and strategic information about the attack itself. There's additional detail that we can record. If I have enough information to assess that this attack was in fact targeted, I can indicate this with the toggle button here. And given the recipient of the attack, the theme of the phishing message, the body of the message, and so on, I assess that this was in fact a targeted phish. I can record that here. If I have sufficient information to assess whether or not the attack was successful, I can indicate that as well. Now, in this case, I don't have visibility into the victim, so I don't know whether someone clicked that link, downloaded the malware, and so on. So I'm going to leave this as unknown for the time being. But I also have the ability to categorize or classify these attacks in various ways, which may help my analysis down the road. So as one example, I can record a relative sophistication for this attack. And I have 5 options to choose from, ranging from very low through medium to very high. Given that this was a phishing attack, not super sophisticated, but they did a decent job in crafting the message. So I'll give them a little bit of credit and say this was a low sophistication, not very low, but low. And I can query this from a relative perspective going forward. These terms, low, medium, and so forth, correspond to numeric values. So within Synapse, I can do things like ask about attacks that had a sophistication level of medium or higher, as an example. I can further categorize these attacks if I choose, and some of the properties that I'm touching on for attacks we'll also see with campaigns and compromises, but I have the option to set a type or a category for this attack. And type fields in Synapse are what we call taxonomies. So this allows me to not only define a set of categories for the types of attacks that I'm observing, but to use a dotted notation so I can actually build out a taxonomy hierarchy or a tree. So I may want to indicate that this was a cyber attack as opposed to one involving, say, physical access to a host or a computer. And I may want to indicate that this was, in fact, a phishing attack as opposed to an exploit attempt or a DDoS attack. So I can use this dotted notation, similar to how we create tags in Synapse, to define a set of categories that are meaningful to my analysis and allow me to further classify what I'm seeing. If I believe that this attack had a goal or an objective, I can record that as well. As a phishing attack, one of the typical objectives for this type of activity is to gain that initial access or initial foothold into a victim network. So if I believe that the goal of this attack was to gain that initial access, I can add that as my goal, record that information. And then finally, an additional key piece of data I might want to record was who do I think was responsible? And when we're talking about activity nodes in Synapse, attacks, campaigns, and so forth, there's two ways that we can attribute this activity. One is through using an attacker field. So we have an actual property that we can set to attribute this attack. And I would use this if I want to associate the attack with a threat group, something that I've been tracking for a longer period of time that's a little bit more mature and which has an associated organization node. I can link that organization using the attacker name field. In this case, we wanted to associate this particular phishing attack with a new threat cluster that we're just starting to examine. So if you tuned in for part one, we had created a new threat cluster that we called Wobbly Emu that was created based on observing the details of this phishing attack. This threat cluster has an associated tag. So to associate this attack with my cluster, I'm going to effectively apply that tag. So under our activity tab, we linked the attack to Wobbly Emu. And if I lift that node in the research tool, we can see that we have tagged that attack to indicate who we believe is responsible. So two different ways that we can attribute activity, whether that's an attack, a compromise, or a campaign. Now, in many cases, we're interested in attacks from an initial attack vector perspective. So you may want to use attack nodes in Synapse to record things about those initial compromise attempts, whether or not they were targeted or opportunistic, whether or not they were successful, so which attacks are succeeding and which are being blocked or detected by various defenses. But attacks can also represent any type of individual threat actor activity that attempts some type of malicious or unauthorized act. So I have the option in Synapse to record additional attacks that kind of map out the various steps that a threat actor or a threat group might take through the course of their operations. So in the case of a successful intrusion, interior steps that those threat actors take can optionally be recorded as additional attacks. So if a threat group is inside a network and conducts a privilege escalation attempt, I can record that in attack along with whether or not it was successful and so forth. So additional ways that you can use these objects to map out the patterns, the playbooks of what these threat actors may do, where they're successful and where they might fail. Now, the second type of activity that I want to talk about is compromises. Within Synapse, we consider a compromise to be the result of a successful attack or a series of attacks. The threat group was able to obtain access to their target and potentially achieve their desired objectives. It's becoming more common for compromises to be publicly disclosed. So you may have a number of different sources that talk about the same compromise. Some organizations will self-disclose. Compromises may be reported in the news media. Security organizations may talk about various compromises that they have visibility into and so on. So when we're creating a compromise in Synapse, ideally we want to identify a primary source of information, something that we think is reliable in terms of the details that we want to be able to capture. So in this particular case, we have an example of DoorDash, who publicly disclosed a data breach from 2019. So we're going to leverage their public disclosure to fill in the details of this particular compromise. I can use my workflow to easily create a new compromise, and we'll call this DoorDash, typing, right? DoorDash data breach. We won't worry about the spelling. 2019. And we'll include the date to potentially distinguish this from other activity that they may have seen that we're recording. And we will add the reporter name, DoorDash. Once again, we'll have to actually type this. Right, there we go. Close enough. And create that object. Ta-da! So we finally have our data breach object. We have the 2019 breach distinguished from another one that they disclosed in 2022. But the key thing I want to do is start recording details about this 2019 incident based on their disclosed information. So one of the first things I want to do is add a description. Typically, I'll try to take a paragraph or a few sentences from their actual report. So in their own words, what happened. And we can add a description based on what they've disclosed. Copy that and add that to our node here. And then we want to try to look at, what was the time period when this occurred? There may or may not be detailed information available from their public disclosure, but we can basically make a best effort. And then if we are able to obtain more reliable information down the road, I can always update the data within Synapse. But looking at what they disclosed, they indicated that they had obtained access on May 4th, 2019. Don't know if this was the date of the initial compromise or simply the date that DoorDash observed the threat actors accessing customer data, but it's our best effort, best attempt, best knowledge at the earliest time of the attack. So I can set that as the earliest compromise date, May 4th, 2019. Last known time of compromise is a little trickier. DoorDash doesn't provide that specific information to us in their disclosure. We can see that they published this on September 27th, 2019. So that's probably the last possible date that they were in the network. Hopefully by the time they disclosed, they had already mitigated the incident. So if I choose, I can use this as a rough estimate as the upper boundary for when they were in the network. If I'm not comfortable recording that, I can leave it blank. But I'd at least like to have something I can use to bookend. So I can use that as sort of a swag. And again, if we get updated information, we can revise this later. I want to indicate who the target was, which of course was DoorDash. Add that. If I want to categorize this, I have this type option here where I can indicate the kind of breach that it was. And I can either attribute this attack by assigning an attacker to link it to a threat group, or I can use the threat clusters tab to assign a cluster and tag this node with the responsible group. In this case, DoorDash didn't provide any information related to attribution, who they thought was responsible, so I don't have anything to say in this regard. But I will go ahead and link my compromise to DoorDash's disclosure, so I know where this information came from. One additional nice thing that I can record with respect to a compromise is the actual impact of this event. Now, this is important because we're seeing, unfortunately, a lot of threat activity that's occurring, companies that are being impacted in various ways, and it can be challenging to keep track of what is the actual effect, what is the cost of this to the various victims. So if I have information related to things like the financial cost of a breach, I can record it here. And this could be something like, if it was a ransomware attack, what was the ransom that was demanded versus the ransom paid, in case those numbers were different. If there was a financial cost that I can assign to the breach itself, maybe there was data that was stolen that has a financial value to the victim, or maybe there's a cost estimate for the remediation and investigation. I can record those values as well to see what some of these impacts are. Even if I don't have a financial impact to record, if, for example, data was taken, I can record the volume of data that was lost optionally. So if I know that data left the network and I know how much, I can record that. Or if the data that was taken had to do with individual records, credit card data, patient data, customer data, and so on, I can record that as a number of PII records that were accessed or impacted. And in this case, DoorDash does tell us that approximately 4.9 million customers, drivers, and merchants were impacted in this attack. So if I roughly translate that or equate that to PII records, I can indicate that 4,900,000 was the impact in terms of PII for this particular breach. And of course, I can leverage that going forward to ask and answer questions in Synapse about the activity that we're seeing. Now, with compromises and with attacks and with campaigns, you may have noticed that we have a reporter field. So if a compromise is a real world thing that occurred, why do we need a reporter if anybody who's talking about this in the media or a blog post or whatever is in theory talking about the same thing? And there's a few reasons where this may be useful for you. Now, for this particular breach, we have one data source currently. We haven't added any additional reporting from the news media or anyone else, so it's pretty obvious where this information came from. But we may have other compromises that we are tracking that were widely reported. In this case, this was a Twilio compromise where they self-disclosed the breach, but this was also discussed in reporting by a security organization. It was reported in various news outlets, and it was referenced by other organizations who also self-disclosed and referenced the Twilio compromise in their own disclosures. So in recording detailed information about what happened, it's not quite as clear where our source information came from. So to be able to say that the details of this compromise came from Twilio is very helpful for us. Another instance where that reporter field and we're potentially creating multiple nodes for a compromise or an attack or a campaign might be helpful is when you have things like compromises that are disclosed, but the victim isn't actually named. This is actually fairly common. This is an instance where Positive Technologies reported on a breach that they investigated at an unnamed pharmaceutical company, and they detailed the activity that occurred in a fairly high level of detail, and they associated this activity with the group that they track as Lazarus. So I may want to capture this information, understand what occurred, the industry that was affected, the group that was supposedly responsible, even though I don't know who the victim is. But I can potentially leverage this for entity resolution later on. If there are other public reports of pharmaceutical companies that were compromised, I may later be able to connect the dots and identify which organization was actually impacted. Finally, there may be cases in public reporting where a particular compromise is discussed by more than one organization, and the details of the compromise vary depending on your source. So I may read one news article that talks about the cost of a breach to a particular victim, and I may read the victim's own self-disclosure where they give a different value. And if it's important for me to keep track of the fact that there are differing reports about exactly what happened, I can optionally create multiple nodes with different reporters to record those different sets of information. So you have that flexibility within Synapse depending on your needs and the data you want to capture. Finally, I want to talk about campaigns. Now, the term campaign and the kind of sister term operation are used fairly widely in the threat intel space, and the meaning can vary depending on your source and what exactly you're reading. A campaign may refer to a phishing campaign. So, hey, we saw 10 or 20 phishing emails go out around the same time and we think they're all related. Campaign has also been used to refer to all of the activity carried out by a specific threat throughout the entire course of its existence. So a lot of extremes potentially in terms of what we mean by campaign. Within Synapse, we try to be a little bit more specific about what we mean by campaign and then let you use this as you choose. But when we talk about campaigns, we're typically referring to a broader set of activity, maybe a more strategic operation that's carried out by an organization or potentially at the direction of an organization to achieve a specific goal or objective. So it's focused, it's carried out by a particular entity, and it has a purpose. So one example of a campaign that we might want to capture relates to some reporting that Group IB provided back in 2022. They talked about what they called a campaign called Octopus or Roasting Octopus. And this started from an investigation they performed on behalf of a customer into some phishing activity that the customer was seeing. And as they pulled this thread, they identified a broader and broader range of activity that they assessed was carried out by a single group, but that targeted multiple organizations, multiple countries, multiple industries, and so on. So this kind of fits our definition of a campaign, and I can use their reporting to create my campaign node. So I can call this Octopus, and that does use a 0 because it's cooler if you use numbers instead of all letters. Indicate the reporter name and create my basic compromise node. As always, we want to include some detail about what happened. So using Group IB's own words, we will do a little bit of copy and paste here to indicate what they said happened. Save that. And then we can record some additional information. We have that option to record the relative sophistication if I want to make that assessment. If I believe, based on the information provided, that this was a successful campaign, or if Group IB is asserting it was a successful campaign, I can use this toggle. I can use my type field to categorize the campaign if I choose. And if I believe there was a goal, I can associate a goal with this campaign. And Group IB actually says in some of their introductory information that they assessed the initial objective was to obtain credentials and two-factor authentication codes. So I can actually specify that as the goal that Group IB asserts was the target or the intent of the campaign. I can associate the responsible threat group. So how do I want to attribute this? Once again, I can use this to link to an organization. In this case, I'm going to link to Group IB's threat cluster that they defined, and they named their threat cluster the same as the campaign. So I'm going to associate this campaign with the Octopus threat cluster. And then I can add information about what occurred. I will, of course, link this to Group IB's reporting, but I can also indicate things like targeting. And Group IB gave us a couple of handy infographics to show the industries and the countries that they say were impacted by this campaign. So I can easily translate this information into my workflow and say, for example, Group IB indicates that the United States was one of the targeted countries, as was Sweden. So I can build out the targeted countries based on their information. I can also build out the industry. So if they indicate that the financial services industry was targeted, I can easily add that. Telecommunications, I can easily add that, and so on. So I can more fully build out who they say was impacted by this campaign. Another nice thing that I can do is if I have information about specific attacks or specific compromises that were a result of this campaign, I can link those as well. And once again, in Group IB's reporting, they actually list a number of companies that they indicate were impacted by this campaign. Now, Group IB didn't out these companies. All of these organizations publicly disclosed some type of data breach around the same time as this reporting. And we have Group IB's assertion that these companies were in fact impacted as part of this Octopus campaign. So I can link the Klaviyo, MailChimp, DigitalOcean. I can link all of these compromises to my overall campaign. So we've created some of that information in Synapse already. And I can easily go through and link these related compromises to the overall campaign. So you can see how the workflow makes it very easy for me to create these objects and create these more more operational and strategic assertions about this activity within Synapse. So why do I care? Once I have this information in Synapse, as you can see, it makes it much easier to view sort of the higher level information related to the various types of activity that I'm looking at, whether that's a threat cluster or a campaign or an individual compromise. But I can also leverage this data to ask questions. So when my boss comes to me and says, hey, what are all of the types of activity that we saw during the last year, I can actually ask and answer that question and say, well, during 2022, based on the data in Synapse, we saw 10 attacks and 9 compromises, and easily answer that question, which makes me a hero. I can also ask things like, what types of techniques did we see? that were used in these various activities and operations, and I can easily ask and answer that question. If I want to know how those techniques that I've recorded map into the MITRE ATT&CK system, because many organizations use attack as kind of a common language to describe what's being seen, I can easily translate those into the attack framework. And if I want to know what was the technique that we saw most often, I can switch over to something like my stats view and say, of all the activity that we saw and all the instances of techniques that we observed, the one that we most commonly saw was valid accounts, the use of legitimate credentials that had been captured by the threat actors to log into victim environments using those valid usernames and passwords and so on. So it makes it much easier to pull together this kind of roll-up strategic information once I have the data in Synapse. So that is our part 2 to illustrate our threat intelligence power-up in the associated workflow. I believe Erica has been providing some additional resources. Part 1, if you missed part 1, an additional webinar that my colleagues Ryan and Mary Beth did on using Synapse for strategic analysis. And as a heads up, the data that you've seen me work with in part 1 and part 2, we will be publishing a blog in the near future that will give you the ability to download that data as a Synapse nodes file. So if you want to kind of drive through some of this yourself and look at it in a little bit more detail, you'll have that opportunity. So that wraps up our webinar. Thank you so much for your time and attention today, and we will hopefully see you in our Synapse Slack. Thank you very much.